Hello and welcome back to the NASJE Spotlight podcast. I'm your host today, Aaron Burdick, along with Amber Myers, and we have a wonderful guest with us today, Michelle White. Michelle, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Great. Thank you all so much for having me. My name is Michelle White, and I'm a senior program advisor at the State Justice Institute.
Awesome. Well, we're so thankful to have you here today. I know that we have a great podcast and a lot of great resources to share with our audience today, and so we're really thankful to have you here. We do have some little lighthearted questions. We like to just get to know you more personally before we dive into kind of why we wanted to bring you on here today. So, how did you end up at SJI? I think it's kind of cool for us to hear the background of how you got into your role.
Sure, I'm happy to share that. I kind of refer to myself as a dabbler because, and my resume sort of looks like that. So I started out my career as a practitioner in the criminal justice system. I've worked in law enforcement, community corrections, been a criminal justice planner, which was a really cool job at the local level. I started and ran an adult drug treatment court in a local jurisdiction. And then I became a consultant and did a lot of work across the country supporting courts in particular, and a couple of other stops along the way, and ended up at SJI. So it's been interesting because I've been a grant writer and a grant funded project manager. And so now I get to be on the other side where I help support state and local courts in particular at SJI as they apply for and receive and manage their grant awards.
Great. And I know Aaron and I are familiar with SJI because of our work with NASJE, but our viewers might not be. So can you tell us a little bit more about exactly what SJI does and how you help carry that work out?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, the State Justice Institute was actually created 40 years ago. It's our 40-year anniversary. And I'm sure I could share our 40-year report to give folks an idea of some examples of over the years, some of the projects that we have funded. But we are sort of an interesting quasi-federal agency. So, created by Congress, funded by Congress, but we are technically a nonprofit organization that is governed by a board of directors. So we're a little bit federal and a little bit nonprofit. And we exist to take those federal funds and make grants to state courts, local courts, and court support organizations like NASJE, for example.
We
Great.
all
So
love
this
grants.
oh, love and hate the reporting, right? As you've
Understood.
been on both sides, you
Yeah.
understand. Um, Then, like Aaron said, we have just some fun questions to get to know you personally before we dive deeper into the
Mhm.
SJI stuff for our viewers and listeners. But our first question we ask everyone
Uh-huh.
is coffee or tea?
Tea, but only hot tea and not iced tea.
Oh, okay.
Hmm. What is your go-to hot tea order?
Um, well, since it's pretty, I like it black, nothing in it. And I, during the pandemic, gave up caffeine. So decaffeinated, Earl Grey sort of berry. That's a little boring of me, I realize, but I'm high maintenance in other parts of my life. So my tea order is pretty straightforward.
No, that's okay. And at the recording of this podcast, we're getting ready to head into the Thanksgiving and holiday season. So finding, a nice warm glass of tea to have and getting everyone's advice on what your favorite tea is always something important for this time of year. I like to try new things, and so I'll definitely have to give that a try. So thank you.
Sure.
Another thing we like is, do you prefer your ideal vacation? Is it beaches or mountains?
Well, I like both, but if I really, really want to relax, it's the beach for sure.
Great. And what is your favorite photo on your phone from the last month?
Um, well, within the past month, one of my kids, my daughter, my youngest, turned 9, so it's probably not one photo, but it's probably several photos. She like her mother, likes to adopt the entire month as her birthday month. And so her birthday is the day before Halloween. So Halloween is for her. And this year we went to Hershey Park. She took one of her best friends and went to Hershey Park. So I think a bunch of those pictures of their first roller coaster experience was probably my favorite.
That's so fun. Good to know kids are starting that tradition early. I think it's very important.
They had no fear. I think I was very fearful. They had no fear.
What is something that you've either read or saw over the past week that you would encourage other people to check out, whether it was personally or professionally?
Oh gosh. I feel like I read so many things. I don't know that they're necessarily things that other folks would even have access to the things that I read. I get really excited. This sounds maybe a little corny about reading people's grant reports that really show off to me the work that they're doing. And this obviously crosses over into maybe some of the other things we'll talk about, but I don't think that people, especially court people, and I try to encourage this quite a lot, brag about the things that they do, advertise the things that they do, and try to get other folks excited because we kind of say courts are over there and they're independent and they're separate, and then we don't celebrate the cool things that they do, and they do a whole lot of cool things in their community. So I don't know that I have one big thing that I would say, but I love reading those grant reports and learning about what people are doing across the country.
Sounds like you're in the perfect position for what you like to do. So that's always wonderful when you find your two passions come together.
Yeah.
Okay. I think our next question is, do you prefer virtual or in person?
I'm going to give the lame response of it really depends. I think there's, it's sort of, to me, virtual is instead of, what is the saying, a meeting that could have been an email. When it can't be an email, the next best thing to me is virtual. But when you really, really want to understand what's going on in a community or have it. Some things I think you have to experience. Some things people can tell you. And some things I remember years and years ago when I was told you need to help start a drug court. And I read a lot, I talked to people until I sat in a courtroom and experienced it for myself. I didn't get it. So I think there's some things, sometimes you have to be in person.
No, I would agree with that. I think that example is something if you've never been able to participate in a drug court graduation or just to see a drug court, I would encourage you to do that. I came from a probation background
Mhm.
before I was in judicial education full time and helped create a couple of different problem solving courts. And so being able to see the influence and the impact that you have not only for an individual but for your entire community is pretty inspiring to
Yes,
see. And I think having education really does go to show that there are some things that are better in person.
yes,
So thank you for sharing that.
sure.
Um, Now that we've gotten a chance to get to know you a little bit more,
Mhm.
we'd like to revisit SJI.
Sure.
And I would like to talk about the grants and how members of NASJE could benefit from the opportunities that you have with SJI, and how does the overall program work?
Sure. So that there's a lot in that question. So I'll try to, you might have to remind me of one piece or two
No,
if I.
that's fine. We can go one at a time.
Okay. So SJI, again, it's federal grant money, but we operate a little bit differently than maybe some other organizations that have federal funds to offer to courts in particular. In that you can apply for funds with 4 different deadlines per year. So that means you don't have to wait 6 or 9 months before you get an answer, typically, about whether or not your project will be funded. The grant amounts are typically smaller. I don't like to ever say a minimum, but certainly there is a minimum to make it worth your while to apply. And depending on the type of project you have, who you are as an applicant, there are some maximums. In terms of the types of grant programs, there are several. One is a technical assistance grant. And so that is really if a local court or even a state court was really interested in, I need someone to come in from the outside, a consultant, an expert, and sort of examine what we have going on and make some recommendations about how we could do things better, different, more streamlined, more efficient, more evidence-based, insert whatever descriptor there, and we don't fund this very much because we're not asked very much, but also technical assistance can mean we want to try this thing. We know this other jurisdiction does it. We want to go see how they do it and have them kind of mentor us. Will you pay for us to go and see that, whatever that thing is? So those are the typical technical assistance grants. Those are for up to $75,000. They do require a match. So I don't get it wrong. I would strongly encourage folks to go on our website to look at what the match formula looks like. Because if I say it out loud, it will be incorrect. I go and look every single time. So technical assistance, that's one. There also are, and this might be particularly of interest to your colleagues at NASJE, which are our curriculum adaptation and training grants. So those are smaller amount grants, but they are exactly what they sound like, which is to either adapt an existing curriculum or create a new one, with courts being the target audience. It doesn't mean it has to be exclusively courts, but that is the target. Either judges or court administrators, if probation is under the court, whatever sort of in the court sphere. So funds to be able to do that, that also does require a match. And then our project grants are usually, but not always, bigger grants, both in scope and then dollar amount that folks can apply for. We most often see states apply for those grants. And those really are to try something new and innovative, either at the state level or the state, and then some maybe pilot sites and a couple of places within that state. And again, typically see like the state level apply for that, or a larger jurisdiction that's going to try something that then could be scalable. And then a fourth category that usually we don't have courts apply for, but what we call court support organizations would apply for. Organizations like NASJE that have sort of national scope, national impact, those types of projects up to and including things that are sponsored by CCJ and COSCA. So national court task forces, for example, or big national initiatives where multiple organizations and entities and experts would all come together around a topic. Those are our strategic initiative grants. Those don't require a match. And the dollar amount really is based on the depth and the scope of the project. I can talk a little bit about how you apply, if that would be of interest. So as I mentioned, I've applied for and managed a lot of federal grants, and I know what it's like to go through that process and what it's like to use some of the online grant management systems. And so I was lucky when I came to SJI almost 5 years ago that they were beginning to have discussions about how to implement an outward facing. We had an internal facing, but an outward facing online system. So I got to roll up my sleeves and dig in and say, let's make it as easy as we possibly can for people to apply, knowing we still have to incorporate accountability and fiscal monitoring and reporting. So we have an online grant management system. If you search for SJI GMS, it's the first thing that will pop up. It's easy to create. I think it's easy to submit applications. And again, we have board meetings on a quarterly basis. So our board of directors reviews every grant application. And then pretty quickly, decisions are made about whether or not they are awarded. And folks can start pretty soon. So really, realistically, the longest you would go in a typical grant season, and when we have a federal budget approved and an appropriation, no more than 90 days. between when you apply and when you get an answer and could potentially start. So that's appealing to a lot of folks because it's close in time to when you've identified an issue that you want to try to tackle.
Oh, that's wonderful. I can tell you personally, I'm going to go back and listen to that 2 or 3 minute segment a couple of times to make sure that I've got everything that I need to bring this to my stakeholders because it is something that all of us struggle with, right? Is how are we going to fund this idea or we've established this need? How do we ensure that we can meet that or tackle what we're trying to look at from a either a national perspective or maybe it's best practices and we're trying to improve our overall operations within our local jurisdiction. So I think what you are inspiring to do is fantastic. The fact that you can turn an apply to answer period in just 90 days is very impressive. So I know that that is also a big thing people look for. So thank you for that.
Sure. And I want to plug two other things that we have done in the past few years. One of them is our funding toolkit. So it's a whole separate website and it's got a very long name. I just refer to it as the funding toolkit. But it has a lot of information about not just applying for SJI grants, but tips and tricks for applying for all kinds of federal funding opportunities. And during what I call grant season, there's a regular posting of grant solicitations that courts would be maybe interested and eligible and appropriate to apply for, or in partnership with their friends in the executive branch agencies, either at the state or local level. So it was really important for us to try to really promote not only our opportunities, but other opportunities for courts, because we know it can be a challenge for a lot of reasons, either lack of experience with grants, lack of staff to actually, and that capacity to write them and manage them. So we have a sort of a webinar training series on there and a bunch of other great information. And then Erin, you spoke a lot about sort of best practices or what are some other ideas. We actually funded another really cool project that I lovingly call Courts and Counties, but it is really how courts can partner with their county counterparts and evidence-based practices that mean those entities need to come together in a planful way, identify, what is your issue, whether it's juvenile justice, family justice, whatever it is, and a lot of great information about research-based practices, types of programming. So I want to plug that one too.
Well, that's all really interesting. I know I've shared the toolkit with some of our courts who are looking to get some grants so that they'd have a baseline of where to start. And so I think those resources are really great, and we'll definitely make sure to link those in the show notes for everyone. One thing I was wondering, you kind of alluded to a few projects in your answers, but could you just give us some examples of projects that have been funded maybe in the last few years?
Yes, the list is long, never long enough, but long. So we have funded so many interesting things from very small but really popular podcast series for judges, all the way up to big national task forces. Several of those. One of, I think, the most well-known or popular was the Mental Health Task Force that CCJ Costco supported, that sort of came out of the opioid task force and sort of all that work around behavioral health and a whole lot of things in between. And many of them do go to local courts and or state level projects. And a lot of them go to other, this sort of, I keep saying court support organizations, but that looks really different. And so I really encourage folks to partner with other experts, with universities. We've given a number of grant awards to universities who then, in partnership with the courts, examine and try to tackle and be responsive to an issue. So, gosh, I should have probably made a list. There's just so many. I'm trying to picture. I was just in there today poking around in the grant management system, looking at quarterly reports that I get to review. But they are on frankly, topics that, Erin, as you mentioned, my background is criminal justice. And so I'm constantly like, whoa, courts do that. Probate, for example, was sort of a
Mhm.
new thing to me. And I was at a conference last week, and I just learned something new every day. So we sponsor or partially sponsor and support conferences of national organizations, of other types of training events where, again, courts are the audience or a big chunk of the audience. So we also highlight on our website, based on our priority investment areas, the different types of projects so that they align with all of those different areas. And so you can read a brief description of what all of those projects look like. I don't know that I would highlight any one over any of the others because they're all so awesome.
Well, I think the fact that you have the idea of kind of what the funding was about or for on your website can really give not only judicial educators, but also those external stakeholders within our court system, ideas that maybe they weren't even aware of, that there's a need out there that, oh, I really like that idea. Maybe we could apply for a similar grant and get something within our jurisdiction. I know here in the state of Illinois, it's therapy dogs are a really big thing that are going on right now. And so we're seeing different organizations and counties starting to get some for their courthouses. We've seen some in our judicial education events and stuff that we've had around. We've had a couple. So I think that there are little things like that that maybe you're not aware of that are out there nationally, that by going to the SJI website and seeing some of these things, you may have ideas that you can bring back.
Yeah, that is definitely our hope. And then another thought that I could talk to y'all all day. Another thought that was triggered is another way that we are different than a lot of other federal funders is that you can reach out to us. You could email me and say, "Hey, I have an idea," before you ever write an application or anything, and say, "Hey, can we chat? Is this something that you would fund?" And we are very open to having those conversations because we want you to be successful, but we also want to be transparent that we can't fund all the things. Our statute has limitations. We can't fund court personnel, for example, or by and large, we can't fund equipment. So we had a lot of those conversations during the pandemic about not being able to fund Zoom rooms, for example, or equipment to do remote hearings. So we really want to help people be successful and know that taking the time to write a grant is a lot of time, in some places more than others, especially in smaller courts that are sort of less resourced. And so we welcome those conversations. And because I partner with a lot and work with a lot of different federal agencies, sometimes I can even say, well, we can't, but you could try over there. And then refer people to the funding toolkit as well.
Great. On that same vein, how do you think us in NASJE as judicial educators can best help courts access these grants?
Sure. So a couple of things. One, I think big thing, and I have done from time to time what I call Grants 101 workshops for people. And a big part of the beginning part of those conversations at those workshops is please don't be afraid. let's get rid of some of the myths and then be transparent about it is work. There are strings attached. You do have to do reporting. There are things that, come with other people's money and it's taxpayer money. So there are things that we have to do. And so I think one of the things that judicial educators could do is really make sure that they are able to sort of talk about what I think of as sort of Grants 101, and then dive into how SGI grants might be a good match for the types of things that folks are interested in, needs that they might have, and then make the connections. I think that sometimes just people shy away from grants because it sounds like a lot, and sometimes it is a whole lot, and sometimes it's not that bad. And I think from my experience in writing a lot of grants for a lot of different types of agencies, once you get the first one under your belt, you kind of know what it's like, and then you know what to expect, and maybe it's not as overwhelming. Or you decide, I'm not doing that. Depending, hopefully nobody has that experience with us. But there is sort of a what you gain for what you have to put into
Mhm.
it, sort of your return on investment discussion. So I think it would be great if judicial educators could somehow take a slice of that. And in their states to say, not write a grant for somebody is not what I'm saying, but maybe be the person that says, it's not that bad. We can do this, and these are the steps, and the things to consider.
Well, like what you said earlier, with you took your daughter to go do the roller coasters and everything. Leading up to that moment, it's scary to get on that roller coaster. And the first time you go, you're nervous. Can I do this? Should I do
Right.
this? Am I going to be okay? And then once you go through it, it's like, oh, that wasn't that bad. And I actually had a lot of fun. Let me do it again. Grant writing is just the same way. If you've never done it, it's a lot. It looks like a lot, or it can feel like a lot. But if you have someone who's willing to be a resource for you to ask those questions, to walk you through that process, it really does take away some of that fear and you reap the benefit of it, right? The whole point of the grant is to bring something to your area that you don't have or to offer continuing education on something that's needed.
Right.
And having a resource that allow you to do that is such a huge help, and hopefully we can reduce some of those fears for people.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be phenomenal. And we also, it's a small little group, but we also work with a consultant to support a group of, and it's started really tiny, but it's growing now, of grant writers and grant managers that work in courts across the country. So many of them at the state level, but some at the local level, who that is either is their job or it's a function of their job. So building that network, and I think that, could be another thing to sort of maybe y'all could help foster, is building those connections, even within a state, of who is good at this, and building sort of that peer network, and then letting them train other people. So sort of being the support that is like a train the
Hmm.
trainer, because there is, I didn't get training before I wrote my first grant, and I was not successful. And I'm not really even ashamed about that. I did not know what I was doing.
Hmm.
But then I connected with people who had done it before and been successful, and they tell you things, that should be maybe obvious, but are
Yeah.
important things. My mantra: follow the instructions. Don't get
I
fancy.
mean,
Do what
you
it
bring up a good point with that because when you offer let's say it is grant writing 101, that's not to say that after that grant writing 101 course, you can't have a mentor
right.
program within your state that can get these connections and get these people to talk because grants are always coming up. Sometimes they're from places that you wouldn't expect a grant to happen. And being able to have that network can really ensure that if you don't get it within your jurisdiction, maybe someone locally will get it and you could still find a way to connect your resources to ensure that you can get that effect in your area too.
Yeah. I think, well, and the other thing embedded in that, right, is that you don't have to always be the applicant. Sometimes you can't
Hmm.
even always be the applicant, depending
Yeah.
on eligibility. But if you can find somebody that in another agency that will write the grant and manage the grant, but either your agency or court involved people that you work with are the benefactors of that grant, all the better.
Mhm.
Because you still get the same benefit without sort of the lift of, I mean, look, I work for a grant making agency. I want everyone to go get our grants. But sometimes, if you aren't the right fit, or if you don't have the capacity to manage it, it's not going to be as successful as everyone would like for it to be. So just sort of, knowing what you're getting into, and that collaboration piece is so very important with any grant anywhere that you submit.
It makes it so much easier when you have support in numbers and in, especially when it comes around to the reporting and doing all of that, if you're
Right.
a small court or a small agency. So I know that that's something in Texas that courts struggle with, right? Because we have extremely rural courts and then we have huge courts that could be their own state system, essentially. So I think that's really good advice to collaborate, because I think that could really help some of those small places out, and also the large ones where the amount of information is overwhelming, right?
Mhm.
I think, let's see, a couple other questions you usually like to end out our podcast with as we're rounding out our time is, what is your goal for this year? And we're coming on the end of it, so maybe you've already achieved it or you're getting close, but it can be either personal or professional, whatever you want to share.
Oh, for 2024. It's funny. I am one of those people that every year considers I need a New Year's resolution. And then what I know is I'm never going to do it. And so I give up before I even start. I don't give up. I just, I just know better. So I think that my goal for this year has been not to try to do it all, but pick the things that I think I can actually be the most impactful and the most effective, and try to do those really, really well. I don't know that I've been successful necessarily, at all times, but that that was what I tried to focus on this year. I still probably try too many things, but that might have to be my goal again for next year. We'll see.
Okay.
I
I
think
think
it's a
that,
good goal though. I really do think that's a good goal because sometimes we get, we volunteer for this or we want to have this idea and we want to go do that, and sometimes we get too scattered. So I think finding the things that mean the most to you
Mhm.
and you can have the most impact in is a really good goal, and I think you were able to achieve it this year just based on what you've told us of all of the grants and things that you've done over the last year. I feel like you've really accomplished a lot.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
yeah, it reminds me of some advice we talked about in our last podcast with the one of our colleagues from Arkansas, Marty Sullivan. He said, he had read this book and it suggested to take your calendar and look at what you block off time for, after you prioritize what's the most important to you. And that will help you start to realize, oh, I need to say no, or I need help to a whole lot of things to get back into this category that's my most important most of the time, which is generally, family and home life and your primary job, not all the other projects you work on just because someone asked you to. So I think that's a great goal, and something that as we set our New Year's resolutions, if people do, that's something to think about as adopting as their own.
What better time than the end of the year to start a fresh calendar with this new idea and perspective? So our last question that we have for you before we wrap everything up, and I think it's always good for us to end with any advice or tips or tricks or anything that you've heard that really had an impact on you, whether it was personally or professionally.
Um, well, I think it sort of connects to what you were just saying, Amber, a little bit, or what both of you kind of been saying, is really about balance and what's the most important. And my grandma would always say to me, family is the most important thing. Remember that when you're running around chasing your tail, when you don't get enough sleep, when you are trying to do all the things at work, just you remember, just sit back and realize that family is the most important. And if you focus on that, everything else will sort of work its way out, or you will work it out. So I try that. I chase my tail a lot, but I try to always remember, when you're thinking about your calendar and prioritizing things, if I have to move a conference call because I need to do something for one of my kids, that's what happens. If my husband has to, like today, he's a police chief, he had to work the road because um, uh, just things happen, then you that's more important than some things I got going on. So I think prioritizing family, you got to take care of what's closest to you first.
I think that's great advice. You have to take care of the people who won't immediately replace you if you leave.
Correct. I can't be
Whereas,
fired.
yeah, you can't be fired from being a parent. So sometimes you probably wish that when they're particularly hard days, but we always got to put that in perspective. Sometimes we focus a little too much on things that would go on without us. So Well, I think this is a great episode, and I'm really excited to share it not only with our friends in NASJE, but with my courts and some of the resources you talked about. So can't wait to see those come through email as well.
Yes. Thank you all so much for having me. And as I really, I'm just really grateful for this opportunity. I think judicial educators really just play an amazing role, and maybe connecting to them means connecting to a lot more local court folks and giving them more ideas and opportunities where our grants or other grants are concerned. Great.
Well, have a good afternoon.
Thank you.